The tyrants will cut through the void like a blade through silk, its massive frame blotting out entire sectors of starlight. Within its cold, metallic corridors, where the hum of machinery never ceased, the lowest of the low-toiled unseen, slaves, servants, and the discarded remnants of conquered worlds. Among them was an 11-year-old human girl, named Clara Miles. No one spared her a second glance as she maneuvered through the ship's maintenance shafts, her small hands blackened with grease. Her uniform little more than a rag stitched together from cast-off fabric. She had been here for as long as she could remember, scrubbing vents, fixing corroded conduits, and tightening bolts that the ship's true engineers never thought to check. Humans, she had learned, were a species of little consequence to the Galactic Empire. The Emperor himself had declared them weak, unremarkable, useful only for the most menial labor. Some species had been absorbed into the Imperial war machine as soldiers or advisors. Humans were not so fortunate. They were cargo, bought and sold in shadowed markets, traded like obsolete machinery. Clara had been taken from a remote Earth colony at the age of 5. Her family nothing more than a hazy memory. Voices she had long since stopped trying to recall. She crouched by a junction in the maintenance corridor, her sharp blue eyes scanning the flickering diagnostic panel. Something was wrong. For the past 3 cycles, she had noticed irregular power fluctuations in the reactor core. At first, she assumed it was a calibration error, something far beyond her rank to report. But it hadn't stopped. The readings grew worse with each passing cycle, yet none of the engineers had even checked the conduits running beneath the main power grid. A shiver ran down her spine. Reporting the issue to the overseers was out of the question. If she was wrong, she'd be beaten for wasting their time. If she was right, they might fix the problem and still beat her, just to remind her of her place. Her fingers tightened around the hydro spanner tucked into her belt. She should ignore it. Keep her head down, do her work, and stay invisible. That was how you survived as a human in the Empire. But if the reactor failed, if something truly catastrophic happened, then it wouldn't matter if she was a slave or not. No one survived an exploding warship. Far above, in the command chamber, Emperor Zalzir observed the void from his throne of shifting metal. His black carapace gleamed under the dim artificial lighting, his 4 crimson eyes scanning the holographic displays hovering before him. He was a creature bred for war, his mind to construct a precision and ruthlessness. His empire stretched across thousands of light years, and his rule was absolute. Today, he traveled to crush the last remnants of a rebellion that had festered in the shadowed fringes of his domain. A minor annoyance, but one he would extinguish with fire and steel. Yet something nagged at the edges of his thoughts. A slight inconsistency in the ship's energy distribution reports. He dismissed it as a calibration delay. The Tyrant was the most powerful vessel in the fleet. No mere system fluctuation could pose a threat to it. Below deck, Clara made her decision. She adjusted the tool in her grip and wedged herself into the narrow crawl space, her heart pounding against her ribs. She followed the network of conduits, tracing the energy signatures through the maze of ship infrastructure. The deeper she went, the more erratic the readings became. The power surges weren't random. They were deliberate. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't a simple malfunction. Someone had tampered with the ship's reactor. A sharp metallic clang echoed down the shaft, and Clara froze. Heavy footsteps. Patrol droids. If they found her here, she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. She pressed herself against the cold metal, holding her breath as the mechanical sentinels passed just inches away. When the sound faded, she exhaled slowly and moved faster. The control panel at the base of the reactor grid was old, barely maintained, its surface coated in dust and grime. With a practiced hand, she wiped it clean and plugged in the diagnostic scanner she had stolen from an unattended tool cart earlier that week. The readings confirmed her worst fear. A foreign device had been integrated into the reactor's stabilization field, a sabotage mechanism disguised within the ship's own wiring. Whoever had done this knew exactly how to avoid detection. The device wasn't set to cause immediate failure. It was subtle, designed to destabilize the ship's core over time, ensuring that when disaster struck, it would look like an accident. A chill ran through her. If she had noticed the fluctuations, why hadn't the engineers? Did they truly believe themselves so infallible that they ignored anomalies in their own systems? Or worse, was one of them responsible? She swallowed. None of that mattered right now. If she didn't do something, the ship would tear itself apart. She hesitated only for a second. Then she reached for the access panel and began to work. The first explosion rocked Tyrants were like a wounded beast. The deck lurched beneath the crew, alarms blaring across the ship as the reinforced hull groaned under the strain of a violent internal shockwave. In an instant, the cold efficiency of the Emperor's flagship shattered into chaos. Clara barely had time to brace herself. The force of blast sent her tumbling against the bulkhead, her vision flickering with pain as the lights above flickered and died. Emergency illumination bathed the corridor in a sickly red glow. Somewhere in the distance, the deep mechanical voice of the ship's AI droned over the alarms. Critical reactor destabilization detected. Core failure imminent. Evacuation recommended. No one would be evacuating. Not from this ship. Tyrants was a pride of the fleet, a symbol of the Empire's absolute dominance. To abandon it would be an unthinkable disgrace. But that didn't change the truth. If the reactor collapsed, it wouldn't matter how many battles the Emperor had won. This ship and everyone on it would be reduced to drifting debris in the void. Clara forced herself up, her small fingers trembling as she gripped the edge of the control panel. The readings confirmed her worst fears. The sabotage device had activated. Energy fluctuation spiraled out of control, bleeding into the core stabilization matrix, forcing it into an unstoppable cascade toward meltdown. The engineers hadn't seen it coming. They were scrambling now, trying to regain control, but she knew it was already too late for them. She was the only one who understood what had to be done. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she yanked open the emergency bypass hatch. The mechanisms beneath were a tangled mess of conduits and energy relays, pulsing erratically as the overload grew worse. There was no time to think, no time to doubt. With practiced efficiency, she dug her fingers into the exposed wires, her mind working faster than fear could take hold. If she could reroute the energy flow through the auxiliary grid, she could disrupt the feedback loop before it collapsed completely. The problem was that the controls for that system weren't accessible from this panel. They were deep inside the engine core itself. She swallowed. The engine core was a death trap now. Temperatures would be rising to lethal levels, radiation seeping to the failing containment shields. No one would dare enter. No one but her. Above, in the command chamber, Emperor Zalzir watched the disaster unfold with cold calculation. The ship's engineers had devolved into frantic shouting, their efforts meaningless as they fought against inevitable destruction. His 4 crimson eyes narrowed, his clawed fingers tapping against the armrest of his throne. The tyrant who was not supposed to be vulnerable, not to sabotage, not to anything. Status, he demanded. Grand Admiral Vorin, his second-in-command, turned sharply, sweat beading against his gray, reptilian skin. Your Excellency, the core is entering a cascade meltdown. The engineers are unable to stabilize it. Zalzir's expression did not change. How long? Vorin hesitated. Less than 8 minutes. Silence settled over the command deck. The Emperor did not move, did not flinch, but those close enough to sense his presence could feel the shift in the air. Something cold, something dangerous. And yet you stand here, he murmured. Vorin stiffened. We. A new voice cut through the tension. Someone has entered the core chamber. All eyes snapped to the tactical display as a single heat signature appeared inside the volatile depths of the ship's engine. A human. Zalzir's gaze sharpened. Who would be foolish enough to enter the core at this stage? Not one of his officers. Certainly. He leaned forward, his fingers flexing against the throne's controls as he brought up the security feed. What he saw gave him pause. A child, covered in soot and sweat, her small frame barely visible against the blinding light of the core's pulsing heart. She moved with frantic precision, her tiny hands working across the exposed conduits, bypassing burnout circuits and forcing new connections into place. Zalzir did not blink. Clara could barely breathe. The heat pressed against her skin, her lungs burning with every shallow inhale. The core pulsed with unstable energy, each fluctuation sending fresh waves of static through the deck beneath her. She didn't have time to be scared. If she hesitated, even for a second, it was over. Her fingers danced over the emergency reroute console. The interface was fried, half the controls unresponsive. If she was going to stabilize the system, she'd have to do it manually. Her gaze locked onto the power conduits, feeding the core's overload cycle. They were meant to distribute energy evenly, but now they were accelerating the collapse. She had to cut them off. But if she severed the wrong connection, the entire reactor might implode instantly. She exhaled sharply. No time, no second chances. With a surge of determination, she grabbed the hydro spanner from her belt and wrenched the primary conduit free. Sparks erupted around her as the ship groaned in protest. Alarms shrieked louder. She ignored them. Reaching into the mess of wires, she twisted the emergency override mechanism, forcing the energy surge to redirect into the secondary grid. The ship lurched violently as the core's destabilization slowed, then held. For one agonizing second, she thought she had failed. Then the alarm softened. The reactor's violent pulses steadied. Systems across the ship flickered back to life. She had done it. Her knees buckled, exhaustion slamming into her all at once. She barely had the strength to stay conscious. In the command chamber, Zalzir leaned back in his throne, unreadable. The girl had done what his finest engineers could not. "Retrieve her," he commanded. Vorin hesitated. "Your Excellency, she is—" The Emperor's gaze silenced him. The command was not repeated. It did not have to be. Clara awoke to the sensation of cold metal beneath her and the distant hum of machinery. Her body ached, every muscle protesting as she forced her eyes open. The harsh artificial light stung, forcing her to blink rapidly until her vision cleared. She was in the throne chamber. Panic gripped her. She had never been here before. Slaves weren't permitted anywhere near the command decks. The only reason a human would be brought to this place was for punishment. Slowly, she sat up, her limbs trembling with exhaustion. Around her, alien officers stood in rigid silence, their eyes fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge her presence. And before them, seated upon his obsidian throne, was Emperor Zalzir. He watched her motionless, his four-crimson eyes unreadable. His carapace gleamed beneath the chamber's dim lighting, the segmented plates of his body shifting slightly as he adjusted his posture. Clara had never been this close to him before. She had seen his image broadcast across the ship, heard whispers of his cruelty from the other slaves, but nothing compared to the sheer presence of him. He was power, an entity that ruled without question, whose word determined the fate of trillions. And now, that same being was looking directly at her. For several long moments, no one spoke. The tension in the room coiled tight, suffocating. Then, with slow deliberation, Zalzir leaned forward. "You entered the core," he said. His voice was measured, smooth, yet edged with something dangerous. Clara's throat was dry. She didn't trust herself to speak. "You stabilized my ship," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "You, a human slave, accomplished what my finest engineers could not." She still didn't know if that was a good thing. Zalzir studied her, as though dissecting a puzzle that should not exist. "Why?" The question startled her. She swallowed, forcing her voice past the tightness in her chest. "Because if I didn't, we all would have died." A ripple passed through the assembled officers, a whisper of shock or perhaps amusement. A child, speaking so plainly to the Emperor himself. Zalzir did not react. His gaze remained locked onto her, assessing, calculating. "You could have fled," he observed. "No one would have expected a human to act." Clara hesitated. She had thought about it. When the alarms blared, when the ship shook and the droids scattered, she could have run, found an escape pod, disappeared into the chaos. But she hadn't. Her hands curled into fists. "I didn't want to die." Another murmur spread through the chamber. Zalzir's expression did not change. "Survival. That is the reason you give." She clenched her jaw. She didn't know what answer he wanted. She didn't know if there was a right answer. The Emperor regarded her for a moment longer, then slowly rose from his throne. The chamber fell into absolute silence. For generations, Humans have been nothing more than fodder for this empire, he said, his voice carrying through the vast room. A species with no strength, no worth beyond the simplest of labors. He descended the steps toward her, his towering frame casting a shadow that swallowed her whole. Clara did not move. But you, he continued, a child, a slave, have done something no officer in this room was capable of. The weight of his gaze pressed into her like a physical force. What am I to do with you? The question struck like a thunderclap. It was not rhetorical. He was truly asking. The Emperor of the Galactic Empire, the ruler of thousands of worlds, was asking her what should be done. Clara's mind raced. She had no illusions about what this moment meant. If she answered poorly, she would not leave this chamber alive. She forced herself to meet his gaze. I saved your ship, she said, voice steadier than she felt. I didn't do it for a reward. I didn't do it for you. I did it because I could. Silence. Then, slowly, Zalzir smiled. It was not a kind expression. It was sharp, edged with something Clara couldn't quite decipher. Amusement? Approval? A predator recognizing something unexpected in its prey? He turned, facing the silent ranks of his officers. From this moment, he declared, this human is no longer a slave. The reaction was immediate. Shocked whispers, murmurs of disbelief. Some looked at her with resentment, others with open disdain. But none dared protest aloud. Clara's breath caught in her throat. You will be given a name within the Empire, Zalzir continued. You will serve me, not as property, but as a citizen of the Empire. It wasn't freedom, not entirely, but it was something no human had ever been given before. Clara swallowed hard, her heart hammering in her chest. The Emperor's crimson eyes flickered with something unreadable. Do not waste this opportunity. She didn't intend to. Clara stood in front of the towering doors of the Imperial War Academy, her hands clenched at her sides. The smooth black metal gleamed under the artificial light, its surface carved with the sigil of Emperor Zalzir's dominion, a mark of power that once symbolized her oppression. Now, it represented something else, a future. She had spent weeks aboard Tyrant's Will after that fateful day in the throne chamber, no longer a slave but not yet sure what she'd become. The crew had not known how to treat her. Some still regarded her as nothing more than a human girl who cleaned the maintenance shafts. Others whispered that she had done something impossible, that she had forced the Emperor himself to acknowledge her. The truth was, she didn't fully understand herself. Zalzir had not spoken to her again after his declaration. He had simply given orders. She was to be educated, trained, tested, not as a noble, not as an officer's child, but as something new, something unheard of, a human within the Empire, but not a slave. She drew a steadying breath as the doors parted before her, revealing a vast chamber lined with towering figures of every species in the Emperor's domain. Future strategists, commanders, scientists, the minds that shaped the Empire's power. And now, she stood among them. As she stepped inside, voices lowered. Some openly sneered. Others merely ignored her. But she didn't need their approval. She had already survived worse. A harsh voice cut through the murmurs. The human arrives at last. Clara turned, her muscles instinctively tensing. A towering Zarkari male, his deep emerald carapace gleaming under the lights, regarded her with thinly veiled disdain. His uniform bore the insignia of a high-ranking instructor. You are the anomaly, he continued, arms folding across his chest. The Emperor's experiment. She didn't flinch. I am Clara. The instructor's mandibles clicked together, as if weighing her response. Then, to her surprise, he let out a dry chuckle. Perhaps you will last longer than expected. He turned away, gesturing for the cadets to follow. We shall see if the Emperor's gamble was worth the effort. Clara said nothing, but as she stepped forward, she felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. Some watched her with amusement, others with curiosity, and a few with unmistakable resentment. She ignored them. The academy was unlike anything she had ever known. Its halls were lined with advanced simulators, war maps that displayed entire star systems, battle formations that took weeks to analyze. Her lessons were grueling, designed to break even the strongest minds. The instructors did not go easy on her. If anything, they were harsher, pushing her to fail. But she didn't. She learned faster than they expected, absorbing tactical maneuvers, engineering schematics, and the political structures that govern the Empire. Every night, when the others slept, she studied the ship systems, dissecting their weaknesses, understanding what had gone wrong on Tyrant's will. She would never be caught off guard again. She was still human, still different, but she was no longer a helpless child in the maintenance corridors. One evening, long after the training halls had emptied, she stood alone before a massive holographic display of the Empire's fleet. Dozens of warships hovered in projection, their designs sleek, their weapons unmatched. Behind her, a voice broke the silence. "You are restless." She turned sharply. Emperor Zalzir stood at the entrance, his presence as commanding as ever. He studied the display for a long moment before shifting his gaze to her. "I know what it is like to be surrounded by those who doubt you," he said, "to be forced to prove yourself at every turn." Clara met his eyes. "Did you?" A flicker of something passed through his expression. Perhaps amusement, perhaps something more. Once, he gestured toward the fleet. "And now they kneel." She exhaled slowly. "Is that what you expect of me?" Zalzir regarded her carefully. "I expect you to be more than they believe you can be." His words settled into her bones, into the very foundation of who she was becoming. She was not a slave. She was not just a human. She was something new, and she would make sure the entire Empire knew it.